So this time of year, I usually, at least one Sunday, talk about the teachings of Jesus in some capacity. And what I thought I would do this year was talk about what would be considered perhaps the greatest teachings of Jesus, which is basically Matthew chapter 5, which is the Sermon on the Mount. Now, Jesus has been in the news this week. I don't know if you've been listening, but there was some disagreement about what race or ethnic group Jesus belonged to. And I've actually used a whole variety of images of Jesus for these different slides, because there is, it's interesting over time how things and people get depicted depending on the culture you happen to be in. But all the images you'll see are images that are used or have been used to depict, Jesus. Now, the other thing I guess we should mention in terms of, the historical understanding is that there is no actual definitive direct evidence that Jesus ever actually lived. There isn't any definitive, okay, we found his body or his DNA or something that's definitive. But however, there's certainly enough written about him in different locations and different sources that, it's probably pretty clear that historically the man did exist. Now, I'm not going to get into the whole thing about Bible development and Bible interpretation, but the thing to understand about the Bible in terms of, and the New Testament in particular in this regard, is that it has been translated quite a few times. And every time something gets translated, something usually gets changed in one way or another. And sometimes it can be very important to the meaning. So we have to kind of take things with a kind of a grain of salt, in a sense, that in getting the Bible to where you could read it in English, there may have been some things that were lost or distorted. Somebody said to me one time, said, well, I believe the Bible is the literal word of God. And I said, which version? Well, the original version. I said, well, we don't have that. That's been lost. We do have some very old versions, but we don't have what would be called the original. Everything we have is a translation of something else, and there's other issues. But there's a tremendous value in the Scriptures. So I just want to talk about this one kind of segment that begins with the Beatitudes, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And we're not going to spend a lot of time on these because I want to spend more time on the other part of the lecture. But the Beatitudes were statements that he gave about who is, blessed are. He said the first one is, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Now, there's one you might look at and say, well, who translated that? I'm sure that's not what he said, right? But no, the reality is the poor in spirit, the meaning of that is those who are humble, those who are open to surrender to Spirit. And that's one of the things we tend to struggle with. So when you understand the meaning of some of these terms, they all relate to things that we struggle with as human beings in order to realize our spiritual nature. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Okay, those who mourn. Mourning is a process that is essential to loss. We might use the term grieving today. If you just walk away from something, a relationship or, something that you prize or have a lot of emotional feeling about, and you don't do a process of grieving, you tend to carry the remnants of that with you into your next experience. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Well, that doesn't seem realistic. I mean, people that are inheriting the earth are the ones that get out there and make things happen, right? He's saying, no, not really. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Doesn't say anything about those who are effective, just says those who hunger and thirst. So these are kind of, very interesting statements. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Well, that makes sense. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God, whatever that means. But pure in heart means in our understanding and metaphysically, we would say you're in alignment with your deepest truth. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. And they've always had an uphill battle, right? In the history of humanity, the peacemakers, right? I don't think he meant the peacekeeper missiles that we have. I think he was talking about something else. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Persecuted for righteousness. In other words, those who hold fast to that true belief within themselves and they don't give themselves up to the opinion of others. Okay, so those are the Beatitudes, and you could spend years just studying those. This, by the way, is the result of a scientific study of what the typical Palestinian male of that era would have looked like. Okay, so it doesn't look like, this sort of got lost in the Renaissance, but that's probably what Jesus would have looked like, something like that. Kind of about 5'1". Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. So, you might say in terms of this was an experience where he was doing a sermon, and he was basically talking to his followers about how they were to be. And Jesus had a pretty radical message for his day. The message that we understand that's been carried forward is a very radical message. It's a message that says might does not make right. It's a message that says we should not be primarily after wealth. We should primarily be after something much deeper and richer than that. He spoke against power and authority. He spoke against the religious authorities and governmental authorities of the day, which eventually got him into some hot water. And here were people coming to hear him speak and to say, I want to be part of this, follow you and live the way you live and so forth. So he was kind of telling them, well, it's not going to be easy. You're going to be persecuted. You're going to be not accepted by the conventional wisdom, let's say, of the day or the social understanding of the day. You're going to place yourself outside of that. And when you place yourself consciously outside of what's socially accepted or what is the overall authority's view of the world, you may find yourself in difficulty or danger. It's part of the deal. He goes on to say, rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. So he's talking about this idea that, and again, if we take a metaphysical viewpoint of this, we don't see heaven as a later reward. We see heaven as a state of mind that is realized in the now. So this actually, I think, makes it more interesting, because when you do take a stand for what is right, you're in heaven, even though you may be being persecuted. A more modern day example of that kind of consciousness would be Viktor Frankl, who was in the camps, in a concentration camp in Nazi Germany. His whole family were killed, and he was, subjected to the horrors of that. But he came to realize, he said, they can do whatever they want to my body, and they can do whatever they want to my time, but they can't take my mind. And he began to imagine conducting symphonies and walking in nature, and he would put himself into these blissful states as he was in the middle of that horror. So that would be an example of being in heaven while being persecuted. See? You have heard that it was said, this, he goes on, this is still in the chapter 5, that you have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. I often say what Jesus said wasn't really popular at the time he said it, and most of it still hasn't caught on. Because what he was talking about was a radical message of shifting what it means to live a human life. It doesn't say stand your ground. Do not resist an evil person. That's scary, right? Yeah. Oh, it's scary to resist one too. But this was the message. And then it goes on, and if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. I know our law team that drew up our statement would never agree with that. Our legal group, that, If anyone would sue you to take your shirt, give them your shirt and give them your coat as well. Now you think about it. Now if you think about that, what is he saying? How is he saying to be? He's saying to be unattached to what is not ultimately is of lesser importance than your own sense of who you are, your own sense of self, your connection to spirit. How often do we sell our soul to maintain our possessions? You see? And he's saying, no, don't do that. This is sort of like a job application for the folks that are there at the Sermon on the Mount, and they're hearing this stuff. I bet a lot of them are starting to say, what did he just say? Because the other thing was, in the back of the crowd, you got a translation because you couldn't hear them. So the people would kind of like they did in the Occupy movements recently, when a person spoke, the people close would repeat it and it would get repeated back. So by the time it got back, it could have mean, don't eat salami or something. But people would hear this and they'd say, man, this is serious. I mean, what he is asking of us is powerful. I mean, if this were announced today, like from a person that was kind of being seen as a spiritual person, like, I don't know, somebody like Pope Francis, say, were he to say something like this, people would probably be amazed. Oh, they are. That's what's happening, right? Very interesting. And the people within the church often are the ones that like that least. The last couple of popes were okay with all this stuff we're doing now. You want us to change. I told Dr. Ken Gordon, our spiritual leader for our organization, he should declare himself infallible. I said, I don't think we'd pay any attention to it, but you could do it, Then he goes on to say, if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from one who wants to borrow from you. See why this part doesn't get quoted a whole lot, like the What? Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. But I thought neither a borrower nor a lender be was in the Bible. Oh no, that was Ben Franklin. I always get them confused. So if you take these statements together, what he's saying is turn away from the values of the outer world and hold fast to the inner truth. And the inner truth will inerringly guide you where you need to go. And if someone comes up to take something away from you, that needed to be released in order for you to go where you were going. It's a whole reversal of the way we traditionally see the valuing of possessions and ideas and social standing and things like that. He's saying become meek, because remember earlier he said the meek are going to inherit the earth. This is what he means. He said, you have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain to the righteous and the unrighteous. Love your neighbor and hate your enemy. And he's saying love your neighbor and love your enemy. That they're the same. Now again, I can imagine the folks in the crowd, which was probably thinning out by now. Hey, there's a guy down the street saying we don't have to do any of this, right? Saying, wow, that, if you put all this stuff together, that's asking a lot. One of the smiling Jesuses, there are not many, but if you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are you not even the tax it says, are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. In other words, he's saying, don't just hang with your family and your clan. Get out into the world. Open up. Spread the word, spread the love, spread the possibility, even though it may not be easy to do, because this follows the previous statement about love your enemy and so forth. It's easy to love those that love you, right? To agree with the people that agree with you and just stay hanging around with the people that agree with you. But it does make it more difficult to have conversations with other people. And then this line from Corinthians 3, which ties in, he says, know ye not that you are a temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwelleth in you? That's in Paul, in a letter he wrote saying this was one of the teachings of Jesus. Know you not that you are God's, and that the Spirit of God dwells in you? Another idea that wasn't very popular. That doesn't say you're a miserable sinner, does it? It doesn't say there's something wrong with you that you have to find an authority that you can succumb to, who may or may not grant you entry into whatever's next. It says you already are. Also in Matthew it says, pray believing you have received and you shall receive. It doesn't say ask God for what you want. So when you look at these teachings in a more expanded way, a metaphysical interpretation, and by metaphysical interpretation all I mean is that it looks at it from a larger view of oneness. The Bible can be interpreted in at least 4 ways. One is historical, and that would be that it's looked at as a document that can tell us about the history of the time and the people that it's written about. And it's hit or miss on that. A lot that's in there is historically accurate, a lot isn't. Another way of interpreting the Bible is literally. And a literal interpretation of the Bible would say that everything in the Bible, every word spoken, is the literal truth. And the problem with that is that it contradicts. There's some places where it says one thing and some places where it says the opposite. There's metaphorical. Metaphorical interpretation is where, don't be so concerned about the accuracy of what's depicted. The message is what's important. What is being said? What is being said in terms of that we're to come away from and understand about ourselves, about our connection to spirit, about our connection to reality. And the metaphysical interpretation basically says that the Bible is a representation of the development of the human consciousness from inception through awakening. That in the New Testament with Jesus, the human consciousness comes awake. And the next testament would be what we do with that. So in a metaphysical context, you would say, what do all of these lessons have to say to us in terms of awakening to the realization that the divine is embodied within us, that we have access to everything we need to express our lives fully, that is within us, and that we do not have to depend. In fact, it's a mistake to depend on others for our good, because nobody else has your good except you. Others can help you to point to your own good within. So if you look at what was said in these statements, and by the way, this is an image of Jesus as a teacher, which is a very common image. And this is an image of Jesus as a teacher from the Mormon tradition. So Jesus was seen as a teacher, and yet, what was the lesson? Where's the emphasis on that? Because we tend to take bits and pieces. You know, when as the culture has evolved in the West and particularly in Europe and Christianity and so forth, which is where most of us have come from, our tradition. There are certainly other Christian cultures in the Orthodox in the East and so forth. But it's very interesting to see what gets carried forward as the major reference points. It's often said that the teaching of Jesus became the teaching about Jesus, that it became more important to see Jesus as the only Son of God, who was therefore the great exception to all of us, and to the only way that can be conveyed and understood is through an authority. I love what Joseph Campbell said. He said, the true imitation of Christ. And Christ Christ wasn't Jesus' last name. Okay, you might say his last name was of Nazareth, right? Because that's how you were called then. You were called the name and the town where you were from. But the Christ is from a Greek word, Christos, that means anointed one. Anointed one. And a metaphysical viewpoint would say we're all anointed. We all have within us that Christ consciousness. The question is, are we aware of it? So you might say what made Jesus different than most people, the vast majority of people, was that he had a better idea of his own Christ nature than others. But he wasn't the only Christ. And this particular quote speaks to that. He never called himself the Son of God. He called himself in the Bible, again, you have to take everything with a little bit of grain of salt because the translation issues and things. He called himself the Son of Man. As a human being. So, to me, the approach to a great teacher is to do what the teacher taught as best you can and to see the teacher as an example. So rather than the great exception, we would see him as the great example. Joseph Campbell talks about the imitation of Christ is the recognition that Christ went to the crucifixion willingly as a metaphorical way of saying you give up everything to move into the divine awareness. You can't have a resurrection without a crucifixion. And much of Western Christian teaching got stuck on the pre-risen Christ. Why is there a crucifix in front of the church rather than a stone rolled away from the tomb? Good question. And I'm not saying right or wrong. I'm just saying, it's interesting to think about that. So at this time of the year, the celebration is the birth. the showing up of this anointed one, and it's recognized. The way the story unfolds in Luke is it's recognized that there's something special happening here, that someone is showing up who will be able to be a way shower. And the way that stories were told in those days was there were certain motifs of virgin birth, wise men from the east, a star in the north. There are at least 25 individuals in literature from that time who have the same birth story, because it was sort of like the way you explain to someone that, hey, this is important. Not the only one, though. So as we go into this holiday season and we think about, what do I want my next year to look like? What are we being called to do? As you list if you haven't done it, I recommend you list your goals and intentions for the next year. Are they things that really serve you? Serve you in creating a deeper resonance with the field of possibility in your life? Are you approaching your desires and goals with wisdom and with love? I always suggest that when you have a decision in front of you, that you try to think, okay, as I look at my options, which one has the most of both? Because sometimes what seems wise isn't all that loving, and sometimes what seems loving isn't all that wise. And if I don't have an answer or a choice that includes both, I need to keep looking. I need to keep exploring. Not so much out here, but in here. So the greatest gift you could give yourself and the world this holiday season is to study these kinds of teachings and to say, how am I going to be the expression of the Christ in my life? As me. Not to imitate and not to copy, but to express it as me. As you. And go into the new year resolved to be centered in that truth. And let the world do what it does. When the world drags you out of your truth, the world loses and you lose. Thank you. Namaste.